Hello and welcome to another episode of the Self-Made Podcast. On this episode, I welcome back Steve Collins to the show. It's now January 2022 and many of you are either just getting started on New Year's resolutions or if you started straight when 2022 hit, are ready to take your training up a gear. And in this episode, we wanted to help you do just that. And we break down what you need to know to really master the art of training in this year. We talk key fundamentals to program design. We talk should you train to failure or not, as well as then breaking down step by step what you should think about in terms of exercises for your programs, how to periodize your programs, and how to get the best results, whether your goal is strength, hypertrophy, or fat loss. So if you're somebody who's looking to start a new training program, this is a great episode for you. Or if you're someone who just wants to understand the rationale behind your current program or your client's program, this is a really, really good episode for you. And if you're someone who wants to kind of take their training to the next level in 2022, definitely reach out to Steve or myself, where we've got a number of things on the horizon for you guys, both looking at membership sites and training to make sure that your results are better than ever before. And I'll leave you with myself and Steve Collins. So Steve, welcome back onto the show. Obviously, last time we did an introduction to you. This is now going to be more of an introduction to training. So for everybody who wants to we're in January 2022, people want to start training, start getting themselves in shape, start getting stronger. I thought there wasn't a better guest to have on to go through the basics of training program design and how to get into the gym. So obviously people know a little bit about you from the last episode. Give us an overview of your experience and why you know training.
Thanks for having me on, Si.
It's on, man.
So, I've been in the game now for more than a decade, maybe 12, 13 years now. Time flies.
Yeah, time flies, right?
It does, yeah. Obviously, I played sport at a decent level when I was younger, like a lot of trainers, injured, fell out of it, got into coaching, training, and been a part of it ever since, working with General Pop back in London. Now I live in Perth, Australia, where I work with different types of clients from General Pop all the way up to high-level athletes. So, yeah, I like to think of myself as a performance coach, but also, a personal trainer who works with normal people,
What I always struck with you when we worked together in London, that was you were very analytical in at the time, very bodybuilding orientated world. Now, I wouldn't necessarily completely call you an athletic strength coach, and you're certainly not a bodybuilding coach either. Like, where's the analytical brain came from with you? Like, I was never really exposed to that early on. Like, where do you think that came from in terms of being able to look at things in long-term models and that sort of stuff?
I don't know. I've always just been, firstly, I'm quite a creature of habits, I like the same routine, I don't like change there. And I just like to be efficient, I just love, when it comes to, movement, exercise, I just love to see good quality movement because, I've seen a lot of bad movement over the years. And not to say that, if you're an athlete, you have to be the best mover, because a lot of times, those great athletes aren't good movers.
The best compensators.
Yeah, they're better compensators. That's right. Yeah. But from, overall, working with General Pop, you like to see him move well, right? Being able to, how to hinge from the hip and bend from the knees and, posture, that sort of stuff. So, I don't know, really. I've just always enjoyed teaching, coaching, and doing a good job at it. I think, I've always been a bit anal with it, like getting them to move right. And it's just the way I coach, Yeah.
So you mentioned obviously training general population to training athletes. And we spoke before getting on this call about a couple of crazy 13, 14-year-olds that you're training that can box up taller than me. Like, is there massive differences when you come to program design for someone who is, I just want to lose a little bit of fat, to somebody who is international javelin thrower? Like, how does the basics of the program change? Or they're quite similar, but with a few differences?
Well, first of all, like exercise principles, principles don't change. Sets, reps, the effects that you get from training, the stress, the adaptations that we're trying to get, that doesn't change. But all of those acute variables do change, rest periods, like certain exercise selection and how you put things together, they all change. All right. Obviously, athletes, most of the time we're looking to get neural adaptations to develop strength and power and the sort of stretch shortening cycle benefits. Whereas, General Pop, we're not really looking to just focus on that, right? So there is some differences in how we program, the two. But overall, I like to think there's not much difference. There's not much difference.
I think it's an important thing to go into a lot as well, because you see it a lot. I remember when I first started looking at the athletic realm in terms of study and training, and you see some absolute charlatans that are just doing stuff for the sake of stuff, right? Like people boxing in heavy gloves and throwing rugby balls and trying to make like heavy rugby balls and trying to make it like the sport. What I would argue is like your job as a strength coach is to get them strong and ready physically for the field. Yep. Their actual coaches are going to be the ones that are teaching them the technique. And and because of that, the fundamentals don't necessarily change too much. But I know this is a broad question and we'll delve into it a little bit deeper, but for you, what are the key fundamentals of program design? What are the things you make sure that are in place for everybody?
First of all, I think general programs do have a place, especially for individuals that are starting out. You can use a general approach. However, everything, I believe everything should be individualized because of the limits of performance, because achieving any type of goal, whether that's fat loss, building muscle, sport performance, people are very, very different, although they might seem similar sports, similar body shapes, they're very, very different. And that's where, a good coach will be able to, assess, evaluate, work with a client. And then, individualization is, very, very important to promote optimal training adaptations.
Yeah. Cool. And is there any, when you say there is place for general things in training, is there any particular things that you think that are maybe not so much in the exercise selection, but anything that you think that you always look at when it comes to program? Like when you're assessing somebody, okay, what are the key things that are nearly always the first things you think about?
Well, the first one's obvious. What are their goals? Training, programs, periodization, whatever you do, it's going to be dependent on their goal. Someone training for strength, power, whatever is very different to someone training for building muscle and fat loss. So that's the big key determinant. I'll just touch, but also there's lots of fundamentals. That's the thing, and a big fundamental is understanding as a coach, you must understand exercise prescription and order. And of course, understanding the manipulation of volume and intensity, even for fat loss, in my opinion.
I think it's one of the things that's overlooked when it comes to fat loss, because we're in this world of more volume, more density, more volume, more density.
Yeah.
But most people are coming in for a fat loss result are people that probably sleep 3-4 hours a night, highly strung and highly stressed, but they can only recover from so much. And this is where I'm a big fan of a lot of the work of Mike Israetel, because he's one of the few people that bought into the general bodybuilding training world. How much volume can people actually handle, and how do we put that in place? So you mentioned periodization in that, and I often think when you're looking at training programs, I think I have a thing I teach coaches, my 7 pillars of program design. The number 1 is periodization. And not because it's more or less important, but because I think periodization, once you choose that, you sort of know where you're going. You've got the overview of where things are. But for you, I know you're big on your periodization models. Why is periodization important, and how do you apply it personally? Is there a certain model you use, or is there a certain way you look at it?
Yeah, I think periodization is very, very important. I mean, sports scientists, coaches, athletes of the former Eastern Bloc countries, they're the ones that are credited with developing and researching the concept of periodization. And it was developed because of the needs to ensure adequate recovery between training sessions, and optimal gains in, strength and power, and in order to optimize performance. So they found that they understood volume, okay, and they understood that they had to get their athletes to peak to perform at certain competitions. So they were able to understand that, okay, there's an inverse relationship between intensity, which is, we know in the weight room as load, and volume. So when one's high, one's low. And that's, changing. They probably do that about 3 to 4 times a year. They have a traditional linear style of periodization repeated 3 to 4 times a year. It's a simple concept. As volume starts high, it drops off, and intensity starts low and it increases. So that's where periodization came from. It's quite a simple concept, of tapering those two variables. But there's a lot of issues with terminology where you live in the world, and is it pre-season, off-season? Is it classified as different words to describe the different phases that people might be going through? I think periodization is important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of with certainly with really beginners, sort of like a linear model of periodization. And I think the reason is because when most people come in, if we're looking at the people, guys listening to this are either going to be people wanting to get in shape for the first time, or coaches training people wanting to get in shape for the first time. And I think it's the model I'm most familiar with, because most people are going to come in, they don't move well. I wouldn't be comfortable sticking loads of weight on them when they don't move well for risk of injury. So getting something, whether it's 10, 12, 15 reps, means that my exercise selection is probably going to be more stable. I'm going to be able to teach them how to move. They're going to need a lot of practice. And as they learn how to train, as they get better, I can just increase that intensity slowly to a point where they can get a really good, heavy 3-4 sets of 6. But we'll work up to that in a few months' time. I mean, is there any particular models you like to use? Does it change with your athletes, of outside linear periodization?
Yeah. So, firstly, you have, like, obviously we understand this, but there's training age is different to age. Okay, training age and how experienced the individual is. All right, and that will dictate what sort of training style and periodization strategy you use. So if you think of a beginner, every week, a beginner could probably see 50% increases in their loads every week, right? I've seen it. You press the 10s, and then next session they go up. Next week they go up by 50%. But that's because their training age is low and the window of adaptation is so large. Whereas if you're working with someone who's a bit more intermediate to advanced, they might have a squat or a deadlift of 200 kilos. They might only progress 2 to 5% over the year. But that's because they're so strong and experienced. They have a high training age. The window of adaptation is a lot smaller. So for beginners, I always use a simple classic model of linear periodization, of a subtle linear approach, just like what you do. Just slowly increase the weight, keep the reps the same. Once they've adapted or they slow down with their progress, then we can change something up. Whether that's exercise selection, reduction in rest periods, which will cause a different sort of hormonal effect on the body, or whether that's just increasing the volume through sets and dropping repetitions. It's different variables. But the more intermediate to advanced, I like to use the undulating model, where you manipulate intensity and volume every couple of weeks or so, or for athletes, every 2 days.
Every 2 days, okay. I've not seen it used so frequently. Why every 2 days rather than like every block with an athlete?
Okay, so it would depend on where they are in their year. If they're in season, we might want the start of the week to be a heavy day. Wednesday might be a lighter day where they work on smaller loads, 30, 40 to 60%. They might work on speed. Okay,
like a daily undulating.
Yes, like a daily undulating. They're all forms of undulating models. There's lots of different undulating models. We might use that so that they get exposure to each different strength, athletic quality that they need.
I suppose in season that's useful as well for injury prevention, right? Because I look at that as like, you don't want to be doing really, really high intensity hamstring work the day before they go out and run and pull a hamstring on the field. Whereas you might do your higher volume, lower intensity stuff on that day, so they come in and it's just a bit of blood flowing until they can recover from it pretty well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So go on.
No, I was just going to say, and that's very much true for the more intermediate, advanced level athletes, because they have, busy schedules and they're very strong. So, doing heavy weights day or two out from a game, it's just not the right thing to do. It just, would be stupid.
Yeah. So, for the people that aren't familiar with what the undulating model is, why, if you've got a linear model and we're coming from high reps, we're coming down to low reps, right? Why would you change that to a model where you're going block of high reps, block of low reps? And what's the advantages to that model over linear, reverse linear, conjugate?
An undulating model will allow the athlete or the individual fat loss, general pop, whatever, more exposure to exercises and variation in intensity and volume over the period of time. And that's all it is. More exposure to variation. And obviously variation is very important. It prevents a law of accommodation. Okay. And as a beginner, they don't need that. They need to stick to one thing and just drive that pattern, drive that load.
Yeah.
And that's all it is. Yeah. It's just exposure to more variation in intensity and volumes and exercise selection.
I always explained it with the undulating model, as in like, if let's say you said earlier on about the window of adaptation that they've got, right? And as you sort of train, that's going to get smaller. And when you hit that threshold, you're not really getting anything more from there. So you change that stimulus. As this sort of comes down a little bit, you can then bring this up, and then you repeat. And the advantage over a linear model, if you're looking at training strength endurance, as you go down the stimulus, by the time you get to strength, you really are detraining this a lot because you've been so long from doing this sort of stuff. Whereas if you sort of bounce, you sort of keep a lot more of these plates spinning. If that's a decent analogy. Whilst
I get it. Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. And like I said earlier, a beginner, they're going to respond very, very fast. Like I said, they can see up to 50% increases in loads every single week. No chance if you're experienced. Yeah. No chance. You're looking at 2 to 5% over the year.
Could you imagine that? My best for in my sort of like higher volume sort of block was I pressed 40s for 10s last week. Could you imagine if I went 60 for 10 next week? That'd be amazing.
You're a beginner, mate. If you do that,
I can love it.
You're a beginner, yeah.
Absolutely love it.
And that's also why, as beginners, you don't need a lot of change with exercises. You don't need to always every 2-3 weeks. You don't always need to change the exercise with beginners. Okay, it's too much. And I see that happen a lot. And
I think it's sometimes you get trainers doing it because they want to keep the client engaged. And a bit of advice I was given by Johnny Jacobs, you remember Johnny? He said to me, he goes, when you're thinking that the client's bored in the program, ask yourself, is the client bored or are you bored? Because you've done the same, obviously changing exercise, the individualization of the program, but the same layout of program, probably 3, 4, 5 times a day, 6 days a week, whereas your client probably does that once a week. And so it's often they're changing too quickly. And then you've got the clients who think, I think the way the industry set up, especially on the online coaching game, is a bit for play for this, is that they hear myths like shocking the muscle, so they need to change things up regularly, or they have to get a program every 4 weeks because that's when the next direct debit comes out for their online coaching. And it's like, if you're progressing, and I've had this before, goes, oh, can I get a new program? Why? Because I've done this for 4 weeks. Okay, are you progressing? Yeah. You enjoying the program? Yeah. Why would we change it?
Yeah, and that's it. And I mean, part of that is you as a coach educating, teaching your client, your athlete, the whole part of the training process, as we always say, it's the journey. They've got to learn. You've got to teach and educate your clients and people that you work with. Coaches, they have to understand the basic principles. All right. How you apply it is the art of coaching and what makes someone a good coach. That might come with experience over time. It might come with your own, experience with training or coaching, whatever. You require a system of evaluation of each training goal. And then based on factual understanding of training, which in my opinion is an evidence-based approach, which is important, then you make tweaks to your training session. Like understanding physiology, energy systems, simple biomechanics, leverage, it can go a long way. Go a long way.
100%. So do you have a sort of, to tie off the periodization bit, like do you have a certain length of block you like to use? I know you're obviously a big fan of Stefan Kazolt's work, and he's very much into 3-week blocks. I mean, I know it will vary person to person, but is there a general rule of thumb you have for how long a block will last?
Mate, there really isn't. I mean, I love Stefan's work and I use some of his concepts of periodization. But ultimately, as you know, it's down to the client and how often and how frequent they can train. There's no point in me giving someone a 3-week phase training 5 days a week and they're fucking missing 2 of those sessions. It's not going to work. What's the point? So we got to be realistic. Don't set expectations too high. Don't tell your client you need to get in 5 days a week. meet them halfway.
Yeah.
But generally, it's easy for clients and athletes to work on a monthly cycle, like every 4 weeks we change. Sometimes that might be every 6 or 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And, for myself at the moment, I'm doing every 2 weeks. So yeah, it depends on the individual, the goals, and there's a lot of variables, as you know.
And I think the key thing in there is like when you're looking at changing phases, a lot of people have these massive overhauls in phase changes. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, because it's like they say they've progressed slowly over a 6-week block. They change everything, all the exercise selection, all the reps, all the sets. And then for the first 2 to 3 weeks, they're just trying to find their weights again. And they've lost this almost a whole phase worth of block of training in fumbling around. Whereas I'm sure when you're talking about changing phases, you're like, okay, my exercise pretty much stay the same, but maybe the reps change or maybe the sets change. So it's very similar, but just these little micro adjustments that just sort of keeps things progressing, right?
Small, fine micro adjustments. That's all is needed. Your body is so, like, as much as your body is so smart at adapting to anything it's given, when it comes to exercise, a lot of people change too often. Definitely. They change things too often and they never see results because they're just program hopping and manipulating things and doing all these wacky methods that they get off T Nation and online, not to discredit anyone that writes for T Nation, but you know what I mean? So yes, that's my opinion on that.
So a big topic that comes up in the industry recently, which I had down here, was like the topic of whether you should or shouldn't train to failure. So obviously some people say that, you should even doubt train harder. I'm to some extent one of those people. And then you got people that say you always should leave 1 to 2 reps in the tank. Where's your viewpoint on the should you train to failure argument?
To be honest, everyone needs to learn. A big part of training is learning how to get out of your comfort zone. So everyone needs to be exposed to training to failure at some point. How it's done is, based on your philosophy, whether you get them to do drop sets or isometric holds to failure. They're all still methods of failure. And I think everyone needs to be exposed to that at some point to understand what true hard work is. There is some studies that show that, you can leave reps in reserve and still get the same results as going balls out. I think if you're training twice a week, it's probably better to go hard and go to the failure. And if you're training more frequently, 3, 4, 5, 6 days a week, it's probably best not to go to failure. But also it depends on the person's stress and recovery ability, Yeah, that's my opinion. I think both reps in reserve, leaving reps in reserve, and perceived exertion, both methods should be used.
I think when it comes to the reps in reserve sort of model and leaving 1 or 2 reps in reserve, I'm not going to say I'm not a fan of it, but I do think that there's one glaring hole in this argument. So you're saying there about studies suggesting that you can get similar results by leaving 1 to 2 reps in reserve, and on paper that sounds good. And I know people where that, if I wrote your program tomorrow, you went, Simon, write me your next block, and I wrote that, I'm like, okay, cool. I reckon that's probably going to be pretty accurate if we do put some of that in. But I think this is where being able to read between the lines of studies and what they're not testing for and how it doesn't really work in the real world, with maybe less equipment to test this stuff, is understand how many people truly understand what 1 to 2 reps in reserve actually is.
Yes.
Especially as a beginner. You get a client who'll go, how many you got left? I've got 2. I'm going to kind of challenge sets in the first block of training. So I'll go, I want to find out where your 1 to 2 rep max in reserve is. So let's say 2 rep max. So 2 reps in reserve, set 1. 1 rep in reserve, set 2. Last set, I want you to go as many as you can. Because so often you'll go, how many have you got left? 2. How many you got left? 1. Then you get an extra 18.
Yeah. I think there's a difference between effort and exertion. So effort is intent to perform reps with maximum concentric acceleration and speeds. Exertion is proximity to failure in a set.
Yeah.
So failure is a funny one because you can have someone who, like you said, is inexperienced, beginner. They don't understand what full exertion is.
And you have to take them there. You have to take them there for them to find out.
That's what I'm saying. So depending on your philosophy and how you like to implement your training, my way of getting someone to failure is going to be different to yours. Whether that's a pure isometric hold or fucking drop sets or mechanical advantage set, whatever. There's different strategies, but everyone needs to be exposed to it. It's a funny one because you can have an individual who's, reserved, soft, they pull out. Whereas some people that are hard, you say leave 2 reps in reserve, they've worked really fucking hard thinking there's 2 reps in reserve, but no, they've just gone 1 rep in reserve. So, it's not 2 reps in reserve, it's 1 rep in reserve. You can't do one more. And that's where like I would sometimes use technology to monitor that. So I would monitor velocity. So I've got something called a push band, which goes onto the arm or the bar, and that can track speed. Okay. So it's a speed device. Okay. An accelerometer. So it measures peak and mean velocity. So when you have a decrease, if you have a decrease in speed, then that person was approaching failure. And there's different, there's some different data to indicate whether they were at failure or not, or whether they're being honest or etc.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well, because you often see, certainly when you're looking at beginners, how many people at the first sign when they start failing concentrically, so on the lift, rather than you see an advanced person will slow down, and this is where your device will come in really well. Like, okay, they're slowing down, they're getting close to failure. Where some people will hit that first wall and will just wriggle to try and get that to last a little bit, right? And I think when you're still at that stage, there's a term I had from an old boss of mine who had the term successful failure, which I use quite a lot. And I always tell my clients this: there's a way to fail a rep. And I don't want to see you fail a rep because you wriggled out of position. I want you to, when you kind of get to a position where you can't really see a flat pull line, because people can see it on the YouTube, they get to there, and rather than letting them go to try and move it, you just hold it for dear life. And 9 times out of 10, that rep will be finished. You'll get that rep, but it'll be grinding slow. But at the very least, you hold tension. If you go also hypertrophy, the name of the game is getting tension, holding tension, creating tension until it hurts.
Yeah, that's right. And that's where like the mean of contraction is important. Whether we go to, weight training, we're only really getting to concentric failure, the shortening of a muscle. We only get pushed to concentric failure, but you could go to isometric failure as well, or you can go to eccentric failure and isometric failure, right? And that's where you do, concentric, eccentric methods where you can't do any more. And then you get a spotter to do, force reps, you control the negative, they help you pull it back up. Or you do 2-1 methods where you push the tricep thing down and you pull it up with one arm. There's lots of different methods to overload eccentric loads, just to get even more stress through that system and muscle tissue.
Yeah. So going on to, obviously we've mentioned now that people should be training really, really hard. And I think we obviously want to make sure that people are recovering. So the other topic I think is very much started to come out more in the industry, which I think is good that it is people start to learn how to match their nutrition to their training. Now, obviously you have a good working knowledge of nutrition, but you are very much a training focused guy. So when it comes to, we talked about energy systems earlier, and we talked about the extra demands from certain trainings. So what things would you think about when it comes to matching nutrition with the training? Is there certain blocks where your nutrition will look very different, like there were certain higher carbs in certain phases or higher fats in other phases? Like, how do you go about making sure that they can recover and adapt easily from the training session?
Yeah. So obviously calories we all know calories are the most important thing. All right. Now, if people are under eating specific macros and still not hitting the calories, it might not mean anything. You've got to get your calories in for how much you weigh and the volume and output of work you're doing. So obviously with, high rep sort of work, you've got to make sure that you're getting enough calories, obviously goal dependent. From a macro perspective, protein, critical for performance. It's the most important thing for fat loss, building muscle, performance, anything. Protein is the number one thing. The second most important thing is carbohydrates for performance, without a doubt. I've not seen many people who can do a lot of work on minimal carbohydrates.
Certainly outside of pure beginners where it's a lot of neurological change, right?
Yeah. Yep. That's my take on it. It's quite simple, really. Make sure the athletes, the individuals, get the right amount of calories, make sure they push their protein targets, hit them as protein targets. And then depending on the volume and what they're doing in the weight room and outside the weight room, make sure they get the right amount of carbohydrates.
Do you ever like, especially when you got people in either athletes in off season when you're looking to make them physically bigger, or whether it's someone who just wants to build tissue or add more food after the end of the diet, do you ever play around with different training systems in order to allow them to get more food in? Like going into a higher volume, higher density program at the same time as ramping up carbohydrates? Is that something you tend to do, or do you tend to look at those things relatively separately?
No, I have done that. Yeah. Generally athletes, young people, if they're playing sport, they're doing a lot of work. Generally, we keep them in shape all year round. So for them to, increase, and normally they're having a lot of carbohydrates, and if we want to build some muscle, we don't always crank carbs high, because in the off season, their work and their output is being drastically reduced anyway.
Yeah.
So they can continue eating like normal and still see gains in the hypertrophy building muscle department. So
because they create a surplus by moving less, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's just manipulating training units or doing less work. Yeah. So they have more energy to go towards that building muscle adaptations. So that's like, without a doubt, very important. But I have pushed, high volume, big workouts in the off season, or with people trying to build muscle and just crank their carbs up. Normally I do like to sort of taper them in so that they can get used to eating more food and more volumes of food and stuff like that. Yeah. What do you prefer? Have you played around and doubled in that sort of stuff?
It's hard because obviously, like the thing for me, I have done, and I tend to like to. It really depends on the kind of client. It's what you write on paper, what I'd like to do, and what happens when a client has a bad night's sleep or misses a workout or randomly goes on holiday, or they don't follow the diet. And it's more just about like, okay, well, how can I get them closer to the calories before I start playing around with how much carbohydrates they utilize in the training cycle? But generally what I tend to do with a more general population fat loss client is that I want to find out what is the maximum amount of calories and in particular carbohydrates I could get them on while still dropping body fat. So they're performing well, their health's in a good place, the thyroid's in a good place, because carbohydrates have a massive impact on thyroid health, obviously deficit surplus level depending. So I will generally start people around about 10 calories per pound, low-ish carbs, but not low carb. I'm not meat and veg. I'm like probably about 100 grams of carbs. Find a routine that works for them. And then as they start to learn how to train and as they learn how to contract tissue, I will then maybe do my next phase will be, let's say I'll do 3 sets 10 to 12 in a linear model. I will go 4 sets 8 to 10. So there's more volume in that training session. There's more intensity in that new block. And I will then try and use that phase to ramp up carbohydrates. For the first, let's say most of my best results are around about 20 weeks. If I have a system, there'll be like the first 8 to 12 weeks, I'll be looking to try and increase food if I can. And then if they want to continue getting leaner, I pull from there. If they don't, I keep pushing. That's the reason why.
So you mentioned about thyroid health and stuff like that. Like, what would be the big indicators, apart from getting blood work, obviously, what would be the indicators that you sort of get from them from a questionnaire, like to know whether they have good thyroid health,
I will never know for a fact if they have bad thyroid health unless they come in and say, I've got bad thyroid health. And then I'll be looking at what the medication that they have on. And ideally, blood work is the way of finding out what's the issue, because it could be that they're not producing any thyroid. Is it a conversion from T4 to T3? Is it being over-converted to reverse T3? So there's a lot of things that could be going on here. If I don't have blood work, often I can tell from what the medication is, what the issue is.
For sure.
So if someone's got thyroxine, thyroxine is T4, so I know that it's probably a production issue. If that's the case, depends how far down the line they've gone. But the thing is, building food up and building into a surplus is going to be the way that's going to assist that production.
Yes.
If it's a conversion issue, that gets down the realm of supplementation. Let's say on the podcast, like,
Yep.
iodine, B vitamins. These things can help, but I don't want to advise that.
Yep.
I'm not a doctor. But
Yep.
when it comes to the things that I think are in my realm as a coach, when it comes to thyroid health, is people often say, I can't lose weight, my thyroid, or, oh, I need a refeed because my thyroid's dropped. But and our new coaches will go, oh, it's thyroid, or there's too much cortisol, that's why they haven't lost this week. But it's a gradual thing. And it's if you put someone on a deficit and they've been in a deficit for far too long, you'll start to notice things like they'll become sluggish, they'll become cold, their body temperature will go down, which is easy to track now. Every building in the world.
That's a big one, yep.
Every building in the world will test your temperature now going into it, so you have an idea of when you go.
Yeah.
Girls will get cold legs and thighs and things like that.
Oh, they get cold hands and feet.
Yeah, exactly.
Big one.
So those are things that I'll start to look at. Appetite,
me too. That's the sort of stuff I look at there.
Yep. And then just play around with there. And then if I get to a point where I think someone really, really needing of a bump up in thyroid, you're probably looking at at least 2 days of high back to maintenance calories, if not above. But I would say 3 to 7, probably more realistic.
Okay.
Cool. Going into training itself and actually building out this program. Now, let's start off with like your indicator lifts. Like, do you have go-to exercises that you would use for indicator lifts for your clients? And on how do you determine what an indicator lift is for them?
Yeah.
And the A series.
Every question you ask, I could always answer it with it depends, right? But generally speaking, let's say I'm working athletic population. Yeah. I always try and follow, movement similarities. So do they jump? Do they twist? Do they throw? Do they push? Do they pull in their sport? What sort of movements, in the weights room relate to that? The kinetic similarities. Do they, is there vertical or horizontal forces? What sort of power outputs, peaks and averages, ground contact times are they using in their sports? And then neurophysiological similarities, heart rate peaks and averages, VO2 intensities, outputs, like metabolic outputs and stuff like that. That's the complex stuff for athletes. There's a famous sports scientist, Virginovsky, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He put this thing together called dynamic correspondence. And it has 5 principles: amplitude or direction of movement, the accentuated region of force production. Well, I won't explain what these are. I'll just list them off. The dynamics of the effort, rate and time of force production, and the last one, the regime of muscular work. And they basically mean, if an athlete is a football player, soccer player, that's how I've got to say it in Australia. What sort of movements occur during what are the things that they need to be a good athlete? All right, and then how do we transfer that into the weights room? So like cable rotations ain't going to work for a boxer, all right, because a boxer's power output is different. So that would be classified as the accentuated region of force production. Maybe we'll do medicine ball throws because how they produce force is different. They don't produce constant force when they box. So things like that is what I look at. Yeah, dynamics of the effort. Is it plyometric or ballistic or dynamic based sport? How do I put that into the gym setting? When it comes to general pop, building muscle and fat loss, I don't have any go-to exercises. I just look to, all right, if it's fat loss, what's going to hit them hard? What level are they at? If they can't fucking squat, I'm not going to get them to squat. You know what I mean? I'll get them to leg press or step up or whatever, depending on their mechanics, their skill level, and their injuries and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But for building muscle, it's a little bit different. We want to target certain muscle groups, depending on the sort of program strategy we use. I mean, we know bench press. It's not really a great chest builder. Isn't it like 70-80% comes from the triceps? So it's not that that's going to be my main go-to for my chest workout, but it does allow me to apply lots of mechanical tension. So I might want to use that at the beginning of my workout. So indicator lifts, I don't really have for a general pop, really.
Yeah, I've had a weird relation with indicator lifts in with my training with clients, because I went for a while, like everybody, going into training when I was 12 years ago, starting from a PT, everyone's got a squat, bench, deadlift, right? So I forced everyone to squat, bench, deadlift. And then I came to work in London, and everyone went down the mechanics bandwagon. And maybe in the early adopters of mechanics stuff, people went down it too far. You're not built to do this, so you do this instead. And they weren't wrong, but they never ever gave me a path to see how close I could get to doing it. Yeah. So I never got any better at movement, and I actually got worse because I didn't learn the skill. So like when I look at people now, like it obviously depends on the goal, but I will then look at my sort of the main sort of lifts that I will sort of look at. So some form of vertical push, some form of vertical pull, some form of squat, some form of hip extension movement, and a unilateral squat and a bilateral squat.
Yep.
So I've got sort of those sort of things, and I'll have a path. I'll have like, and these are, I don't like the term regressions, because I like using the example of a hip thrust to an incline hyper. They're not progression or regression. They're just different. One challenge is more short range, one challenge is more mid range. But I look at, right, okay, my A series are going to be things that are going to be the most load bearing, the stuff that I can use to be able to decide what my other lifts are going to be, something I can work on weaknesses.
Makes sense.
But everybody will fall within that spectrum. If back squat's here, and let's say leg extension is my first bilateral squat progression from stability. When I say progressions, I took stability progressions. So Robert squat to front squat, safety bar squat to back squat, you know? Yep. So most people will fall somewhere in the middle and will never squat. But at least we're getting them closer to where their squat is, or finding a squat that works for them and plugging the gaps. So if someone's like me, who is got long femur, short tib vid, my squat's going to look more like a good morning than a squat. And it's going to be wide stance, it's going to be heels elevated. So my accessory work, which we'll go on to in a second, is going to be more hack squats, leg extensions, split squats, stuff that gets the quads working. But someone who's got this perfectly upright squat, this little short 3'4" motherfucker, would probably have more good mornings, more leg curls, more deadlifts, more hip extension work, because their glutes don't really come into the squat too much. You know, and so that's sort of where I look at my indicator list now. It's like there's an idea with squat, bench, and dead sort of in the forefront of our mind, but most people won't get there. You know, and onto your bench press comment, like I think it can be a good exercise for chest if you have a barrel rib cage. Yep. But most people don't have a barrel rib cage. Most people aren't that lucky. I'm certainly not. So for me, dumbbell presses, flyers will be a better chest builder than bench press will ever be. But I still like to.
So why would the bench press be beneficial if you have more of that barrel rib cage?
There's a better line of pull, right? So if you look at somebody who's, I feel sorry for anyone listening to this on audio. You're going to have to try and work with me. And if someone's got like a high angle coming out of their neck and they've got, you can rest a pint like on their rib cage. The ability here, if I arch up here, that ability to pull my arm across, which is what the pec does, is pulling the arm across the midsection, is going to be greater. If I'm here, there's hardly any ability to pull here. So it just becomes front delt. And this is why two people can go into the gym and go to get on the bench, and one of them goes, oh man, my chest's so sore today. And the other person goes, really? I just feel front delts. I must be doing it wrong. They're not. It's just not the right exercise for them.
That's it. You know? Individualization, right? Individualization.
And for that person, the bar probably shouldn't touch their chest. If you've got long arms and you're trying to touch the bar to your chest, you're probably losing out if your goal is to build a chest. I'm here. I get as far as I can and I get stuck. That's probably about an inch off my chest. I can keep my chest working there, but if I go further, everything's going to roll forward. I'm going to lose position and we're taking tension away. So that person, I'll put like the hip thrust pad and touch that. So we can make sure that every rep is replicable, every single set, but we're not pushing them to a range that they don't own.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So moving on to the accessory work. So you found whatever your initial lift is, right? Obviously individual to the sports, the person to the athlete. Now, general rule of thumb with strength training, I think you think the same way, is that your B series, your accessory work is stuff that's going to be still relatively compound and big lift, but things that are going to push up the main lift. Is that the way you think, or is there a different rationale you have with your B series?
No, that's definitely, I just wanted to say, like, your idea and concepts of, having those in the forefront, those deadlifts, those presses, that is also my way of thinking as well. Just to get that across. And so, yes, my accessory work is not always, it is a lot of the time to help push those main priority exercises up. But at the same time, also trying to increase the global athleticism of my individual.
Yeah, interesting.
Whether that's like as an athlete or physique athlete, because I'm so much into movement quality and being a strong motherfucker, I always want, whether it's to fat loss or look good, hypertrophy, like I always want them to move better. You know what I mean? So if I can add to their global athleticism, then that's in my B series.
Yeah, yeah. And when you talk about global athleticism, like what, obviously, other than plugging weaknesses, give me an example of how it would work in terms of improving someone's global athleticism if someone doesn't know what that means.
I think the word sounds more complex than it actually is. I think it's just pushing those lifts up, and not doing stupid exercises in their B series of a program. Do something that is big and compound that helps their first exercise that isn't just leg extensions.
Yeah. I suppose it'd be also like as well if you're looking at global athleticism, you're not using it to pull up the lifts. My example of looking the way someone squats and using the B series to address the things that aren't getting enough love in that lift because of the way they move, right? Yeah. Like, for sake of argument, if someone wants to bench in their A series or you think it's going to be a good lift, if they've got a flatter rib cage, there's going to be a lot of tricep work. You're probably going to have more chest exercises, more isolated, maybe dumbbell presses, flies, floor presses in the B series, where someone's got a big rib cage and maybe it's not as much tricep work in the bench. You might have more, close grip bench press, California press, skull crushers, that sort of stuff in the B series to plug the weaknesses, right? Yeah,
exactly. And again, it depends, on the sort of training, the periodization model you're using, and how frequent that person is training, if they're only training twice a week, you might not want to do something in the B series that pushes the A up. You might want to do another big movement pattern. There's no reason why you can't barbell squat and then in your Bs go and do some trap bar deadlifts. Why not? It depends on the frequency and and the training system you're using. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So with what about with your C series and your tertiary exercises? Like, how do you sort of look at programming them? Are they still with the A series in mind? Are they more physique focused? Again, I know the answer, it depends. But sort of like, is there any sort of things you're sort of looking at including in those into the way thought process?
If I think of physique, trying to, build muscle on a frame, I'll always try and tag something in there that's going to help lagging body parts. Yeah, like, if it's someone more athletic, then we're going to, put exercises in there that bring up, weak muscles, weaker strength muscles,
or remedial stuff.
Remedial stuff, yeah, like rotator cuff work, whatever it may be, calf work, etc. For fat loss, whatever that might tax them a little bit more and help them with their A's and B's, So, it's very goal dependent.
I think it's a very good explanation.
General, I know, but again, we always take our methodological approach.
I know what you mean. Anyway,
how I like to train my clients and what method I believe in. They're hard questions to answer, really, because it depends.
I agree. I think when I look at C series, I think. I'm coming this from a more physique-focused world, maybe, I know you deal with plenty of that as well. But I look at that, when I look at two things I look at, it's like, right, if I want to improve someone's movement capabilities, one, right, so I'm looking slightly in that remedial headspace, like, if I can help someone move better in this first phase of training, that's going to give me less headaches in the second and third phase of training, because things that you can do bigger lifts quicker, you can get more out of lifts, you can do, that sort of stuff. They're more stable, so which means if they're more stable, they can produce more force. My favorite Charles Poliquin quote ever is, "You can't fire a cannon from a canoe." But on the flip side of that, I'm looking, okay, they've come in for a particular goal in terms of how they want to look. And from a physique standpoint, I'll look at their before pictures and go, right, what is the weakest body part? Because I think you're only as big as your weakest body part. And using me as an example, so I don't offend anyone, if you look at pictures of my back, my triceps are probably my smallest body part, getting better, but smallest body part. So my triceps make my back look smaller. My back does not make my triceps look bigger. So I was like, okay, so I'm looking to bring that up. And then could I kill two birds with one stone? And the example I always use is like, okay, if I want to give someone more range and open up the pec, if I want to get someone, elongating the length and range of their bicep, that sort of stuff. If I come into an incline bicep curl, I'm having an exercise now that allows them to move better through the shoulder and get some more shoulder extension at the same time as growing their biceps. So it's not me going, Or could you sit and do this external rotation drill and the client's bored to tears? Like, do you know what? How about we get something in this position here? How about we get overhead with the tricep work? So now you're still getting big triceps, but we're actually now improving the serratus's ability to move the shoulder blade and things like this. It's like if we can kill two birds with one stone, the client's getting a bit of what they want, but you're making sure they get a bit of what they need. And you can't always do that with certain muscles, but you'd be surprised how often. A prone trap three will get someone better lower traps and better delts.
And that's it. Like, the way I look at that as well is like, if you're doing a session, like why would you ever chuck in, if you're doing a shoulder session, would you ever chuck in lateral raises to start the session? Yes or no?
No.
Why not?
Ooh, if I was doing a shoulder session, would I?
Yeah.
I would argue sometimes yes, but
exactly.
Rarely.
Yeah, I was hoping you said yes sometimes.
Yeah.
Depending on what phase you're in.
Lateral raises are singly the best exercise for delts ever.
Yeah, exactly. And why would you, if you did that, why would you do it?
Why would I do it?
Simple answer. Why would you throw lateral dumbbell raises or whatever, cable, whatever, in the beginning of the workout, of a hypertrophy workout to hit the shoulders?
If it's just shoulders and nothing else, they are the most effective, most efficient exercises to do the job. So I want them to hit it while they're fresh. Yeah,
exactly. So you're using that to exhaust the muscle tissue. So sometimes when you're working with people, you don't need to add your C's at the end. Just front load it at the beginning of the session, and then then go through your squats or whatever, or your bench press, right?
I think there's a general
front load it.
Yeah,
front load it.
Luke Lehman talks about this quite a lot. He talks about this. There is general rules of how to write programs, but rules are meant to be broken. So general rule is A series, the things that require the most stability demands when you're fresh. B series, slightly bigger lifts that still require a little bit of stability. C series, the stuff that you can just do when you're tired. That's the rules. That's how you would follow 90% of your program design. But there are rules are meant to be broken. And that's when he came up with like backloaded structural balance stuff, where he talks about like you do some loaded stretching at the start, you open up the hips and get someone a bit of extra range. Then you do a drill at that length and range. Then you go into a back squat. Now, I probably wouldn't give a complete beginner that phase because I don't want to fatigue them going into the big lift. But for somebody who maybe want to do some structural balance work, it's had a year or two of training under their belt, what a great method of actually like making stretching work for you rather than just endless monotonous stretch.
That makes sense.
And that's another conversation, another episode. But cool. So going into then just finishing off a little bit into, I had one question on tempo and velocity because I know that's something that you focus a lot of your time on. But the first, when a lot of people here are going to be training for building muscle or losing fat. So when it comes to training for strength versus training for hypertrophy, other than rep ranges, how do those types of programs differ?
Well, when you're training for strength, you are trying to get neural adaptations. When you're trying to train for building muscle, you're looking for morphological adaptations. There is a crossover. Hypertrophy intensities 60 to 80% work best, 6 to 12 reps work best. Classically, we know volume as reps times sets. Okay, so you want to push volume as a driver. However, tension threshold is very, very important also. And we must meet that tension threshold and create mechanical tension, which is heavy ass weights. So that's the strength side. So to build muscle, you still need to apply mechanical tension. This is where a variation of both work well for hypertrophy and strength. So, with hypertrophy, you want to create workouts that lead to drastic acute fatigue in the neuromuscular performance of your session that accumulates more blood lactate and a considerable acute hormonal effect. Women tend to fatigue less faster than men. And that's probably because they lift lighter loads. I think that's the main reason. And I think they have a better ability to replenish glycogen faster as well. But I think
lighter load have a lot to do with that.
Yeah, they're the main two differences. You know what I mean? So obviously strength, low reps, heavy ass weight makes sense. Long rest periods, where the opposite for the hypertrophy difference.
What about training for fat loss? Because this is something that like you'll see done wrong tons and tons of times. People are training. They aren't giving you the answer already, but training for fat loss, where their exercise section is based around fat loss. when you're training for fat loss, do you train for fat loss or do you train for hypertrophy and then let the diet do the fat loss?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Obviously, nutrition is the most important thing. You need to apply the calorie deficit for fat loss. Without that, nothing much is going to change. But and that's, I know what you're saying, because training is just the stimulus. It's what you do with the other 23 hours of the day where those adaptations occur is more important for fat loss. It doesn't matter how many calories your watch says you burn. But saying that, when you're training, maybe you do want to emphasize workouts that promote a sort of global hormonal cascade and, again, those drastic acute fatigue changes throughout. So German body composition style workouts work very well. Circuits, stuff like that. There's many ways to train for fat loss.
When it comes to periodizing fat loss, do you look at, I know Stefan is a very big fan of, if he wants fat loss in his athletes because he can't go too low on the calories in season. He needs to play around more with the training, and he works a lot with increasing density block to block. Is that something you do when it comes to fat loss workouts?
Not really. I don't really work with any athletes that are too fat or overweight. I don't really see anyone that, maybe in the off season, but generally speaking, athletes are doing so much skill work and field work or whatever. They don't get out of shape, they know when they need to cut down and stuff. They get caliper tested at their clubs and at their sports. But I don't really do that. No, I don't really do that.
Would you look at that sort of stuff if you, let's say, you came back and worked in a body composition gym again in London? If you ever did that, would you look at that in terms of training, or would you just focus on, let's use this training to maintain muscle mass as much as possible? Obviously, you're obviously looking at both. But the sort of aim I'm getting at is do you play around too much with changing the approach you take over a 3 to 4 block phase, a macro cycle, when a client's goal is fat loss, compared to if a client's goal was hypertrophy?
It depends on the experience of the individual, their training age. Like I said, training age is different. A beginner, it's a hard question to ask. I don't really change it too much. No, the workouts look very similar. Maybe at the end of the workouts, it might look a bit different, for fat loss sort of stuff. And we might just tax in with more metabolic work at the end, conditioning, air bikes, sleds, prowlers, that sort of stuff. Athletes, yes, sometimes that sort of stuff. Building muscle a little bit different, I think.
Yeah, I very much don't.
If that answers your question.
Yeah. I've dramatically dropped the amount of necessarily Metcon that I do with clients since leaving our last employer, where the track and the sleds were commonplace. And I think there's an element of if someone comes in with really poor aerobic health, really high blood pressure, this thing, that's a different kind of story. But a lot of that I get them to do outside of their sessions, because I've never a lot of times if I see it with coaches go, we've got to make sure that we give them the experience. And I'm like, rarely do we get a client go, can we skip this set of bicep curls so I can get on the prowler and the air bike? I love that bit. They don't enjoy it. It doesn't burn hardly any calories. What am I doing it for? I'd rather just give them an extra set of volume on something that's probably both.
It is, and that's it. It's probably their previous experience of what they think it's doing. How many coaches think Epoch has an effect? It doesn't really have an effect. Burning calories after your workout. It's just small. But some people do like that stuff. I work with a lot of people. They come in and say, "Oh, I want to do more conditioning and stuff like that."
I never get those people.
Yeah, I do all the time. I get people like that all the time. They love it. But once they get really strong in the weights room, then they hate it. They hate it because now they're lifting heavier loads. They can produce more force, more power. Air dynes aren't fun anymore. Prowlers, we've got to load that shit really heavy. Now they're doing high intensity training. A lot of people, they're not really doing high intensity training, what they think is high intensity training, right?
Yeah. I also think, would you keep, and this again, we'll do a whole episode on energy systems at some point in training, but I would also look at keeping that stuff away from the training session if possible. I'd rather make your training session. If you can come back and do some HIIT work, if I'm going to put HIIT in your program, if that's something which I rarely do these days, I will put it separate to your training session.
I've had people do it in the same session at the end. I've had people do it at the beginning. I've front-loaded conditioning sometimes.
Interesting.
For my older population, injured people, I front-load their conditioning sometimes. But at the beginning of the workout, then we go on to our weights.
So going off of the topic, the last question I have for you here. So concentric versus eccentric loading for general population clients. This is something I came to recently where I've had people say to me that concentric is safer for people, so better for Gen Pop because they can, they don't have a struggle with recovery from eccentric load. Some people say that eccentric is more effective because the effect it's going to have on tension and things like this and control at end ranges. What's your take on concentric versus on eccentric lifts? Like a floor press or a pin press where you sort of just drop it over a slow control full dumbbell press or barbell press?
Well, I mean, like when you're doing eccentric focus work, there will be soreness, no doubt. I don't always think that's because of doing eccentrics causes lots of soreness. I think a lot of the time it's just people aren't prepared to do it. They haven't been prepared to do it. Because listen, when someone experiences an excessive stimulus or a novel program or session, your body will start with an inflammatory response, and eccentrics just going to do that a little bit more, so therefore you have to expose people to regular stimulus of eccentric training. You can't just go into something eccentric loaded. Whereas our weights room activities are very concentric based. We work concentrically to failure. We know eccentrically you can produce approximately about 120% more than concentric force and up to 180, 200% more. So that's big, heavy loads if you're going to do eccentric work. But going down to the basics, I think they should both be used. I don't think, you can do eccentric training with submaximal loads. You just basically manipulating time that's spent under tension. You add a pause in the bottom of the squat, go down slowly, add a pause in the bottom of the squat, come back up, go down in 4 seconds. That's not dangerous. That's teaching someone how to move well.
You can make the argument, sorry to cut you off there, but you make the argument as well with eccentric stuff that you can handle more loads on an eccentric focused training session. But are you actually handling more loads? Or is it the fact that you're actually decelerating the weight on an eccentric, that you're actually not actually lifting more weight? If I've got to generate more force to lift that 100 kilo barbell.
That's different. There's different types of, you can eccentrically, you can work with submaximal weights, and eccentrically you can work with supramaximal weights. Obviously, that is supramaximal work, working at 130% of concentric failure. Okay, so if your 1 rep max is 100 kilos, you to do supramaximal lift eccentrics, you have to work higher than 100 kilos. You have to work between 101% upwards. That's for advanced individuals. That's why I don't dig when you get people that can't do chin-ups that are fairly beginners and you're giving them eccentrics. I hate it because that's a supramaximal technique. That's very, very intermediate to advanced. They shouldn't be doing that. But you can use submaximal eccentrics, which is the lowering of a weight very slowly. I think that's very, very safe because look, eccentric training, it has a low metabolic cost. All right. It relies greatly on passive tissue and tendons. Okay. So it's going to recruit those passive tissues and tendons more than just concentric based training. Right. There's a high capacity to develop intramuscular tension. So that's how you develop the skill. You learn how to intramuscularly develop tension, and it helps change the stress curve, meaning that it can lower the risk of injury. It can lower the risk of injury. So eccentric training develops skill, deceleration capabilities better than concentric based training will. So I think isometrics, eccentrics, then sort of concentric movement patterns come next. Does that make sense? That's how I look across that. That's how I would go across that sort of. That's how I would go.
Good explanation. Totally makes sense. Yeah, and I think even with the super maximal eccentric work, right?
It's advanced stuff.
it's advanced stuff. And I don't necessarily think you're handling more load. Yes, there's more load on the bar, but the actual amount of force going through the muscle is probably very similar. Because for me, if I'm pressing a 100 kilo weight, I need to generate enough force in the tissues to accelerate and push through 100 kilos. Whereas on the way down, I'm only decelerating. So I could put 110, 115 on the bar, but the actual force that's going through the joints may be the same because of the difference in output that I'm doing. If that makes sense, the difference, I've got to overcome it rather than.
Yeah. But this is the thing, like there's different population. For general pop, that makes total sense for fat loss, build a muscle, general pop. But for athletes, the capacity to resist yielding is a key determinant of athletic success, speed, and explosiveness, without a doubt. So for them to be able to control really fucking heavy ass weights, it's going to have a direct transfer to injury prevent. It's why there's so many studies and good quality research on those Nordic falls. They just do a couple of Nordic falls every week, and it drastically reduces the risk of hamstring tears. There's a reason why they're done. They work. Overloading eccentric. But then there's also, I know what you're saying, but that's why people use accentuated eccentric training methods. All right, there's they use eccentric hooks, and they use flywheels that when you push up fast, the flywheel pulls you down fast. So they're all different eccentric methods, and they're very, very beneficial. But more for the athletic population. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, cool. So just sort of to close off then, that was really, really good. I think if people listen to that, I've got a good idea of some of the things to think about when putting their program together in the gym. So a question that I always close with now, since I got on a podcast with Chris Van Vliet, and I thought it was a really simple but really good question. What are like the top 2 things you're most grateful for right now?
Right, you know what? It's a mad one, isn't it? Like, being in Perth on the February the 5th, our state government said that they're going to open up the borders and travel. So we're looking forward to traveling home or having family come over.
Yes.
And then they went back on that word. They said, because of Omicron and what's going on in the eastern states, they're not going to open. They're going to delay that. Now, I know I'm diverting here, but I understand why they're doing it. But also, as leaders, they shouldn't be going back on their word.
Yeah.
So I miss my family a lot. And, I appreciate technology, being able to just FaceTime them, call them. Man. It's a bit of a funny one, but that's I'm grateful for technology right now and being able to, we're in different parts of the world and we can still communicate, talk, catch up, WhatsApp, FaceTime, do this. I appreciate the technology and what it's allowing us to do right now with these hard times, It's a bit of a weird one.
No, I think it's a good answer. And I think social media is this social media is this thing where people look at it as they often look at the negatives of it. And I'm like, there are people in this pandemic era of these last 2 years where I'm solely friends with them through reaching out on social media, because if I didn't have that, I'd probably be seeing my friends down the road more. I'd probably fly home more. But I've had to connect with people, and I've connected with different new people and more interesting people, and at the same time I can still keep in touch with my family. And I'm very, very much the same boat as you. I don't think we're likely to properly get home without a big long quarantine for a long time. We're looking to come home in the summer, and it's going to be at the moment it'll be 2 to 3 weeks washout period. So I have to go somewhere else first, and then a 2 to 3 week quarantine in the hotel here just to go home because the flight ban. It's absolutely mad. So just to close you off, but anyone wants to find out more about you, what you do, some of the stuff that you put online, I know you're starting to put more stuff up, which is good, because I remember the last time we spoke, I was telling you off for not putting enough up, and thankfully you are starting to do it. So where can people find you?
So, I've got my website, stephencollinstraining.com. I'm putting up articles there on a regular basis now. Got some more that are going out soon. Just drop me an email if you want to get in touch, training or any advice or whatnot. My social media pages, same thing, Stephen Collins Training on Instagram and Facebook page. I'm starting to put more stories up and do what you lot are doing, like everyone else is doing. I might as well share information, basic, advanced, everything. But I'm based in Perth. If you're about listening, then hit me up, innit? And that's me, innit?
Awesome, man. Thank you very, very much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I'll speak to you soon.
All right, bro. Thank you very much. See you later.